Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Victoria Cervantes, to discuss conflict, climate, and migration. Victoria Cervantes got her political science degree from the University of Colorado. She's been a longtime activist in Latin American solidarity work, also in union organizing and labor rights. She is currently the co-coordinator of the Honduras Solidarity Network. And we want to discuss the broader topic of conflict and climate and migration from Honduras, although we can expand that if we need to. So I guess my first question is, why Honduras? I mean, when I think about repression or violence against the working class and indigenous folks, it's in multiple countries. There was a U.S. coup in Venezuela some time ago, and recently in Haiti and Bolivia. So what draws you to Honduras and the Honduras Solidarity Network?
Well, it's true. There's an endless list, unfortunately, of countries that need solidarity and deserve solidarity. Honduras was in part accidental. I was already active in Latin American solidarity, immigration rights. And then in 1998, there was this enormous hurricane in Central America that destroyed big parts of Honduras and Nicaragua. And in our group that was doing all this work for all these countries, there were 2 or 3 Hondurans who were, of course, anguished, yes, and who brought up the point. They said, well, no one ever does any solidarity with Honduras. I know we never made a revolution, we never did this, you know, maybe we don't deserve it. And so we were like, oh no, of course we should take up solidarity. Yeah. And then once we started working there, what became clear was the importance of Honduras for U.S. policy and U.S. Goals in Latin America. It has a great strategic, and always has. It's been basically a U.S. military base used against other countries, including Venezuela at the time of the before the 2002
How big
coup.
Is the U.S. base there? Is there just one base?
No, there's one major base, and it's not enormous. That's Soto Cano base. And I think it has 500 standing troops normally, but of course a lot of
you can just
movement.
Use it to fly through.
Right, and it's a major in terms of the airfield. And Southern Command is very active, comes to Honduras all the time. And then they have a whole number of what they call facilities. At one point we thought there were maybe 13, and we don't even know what they all are, scattered around. So there was that. We discovered how important it was. We also found, as we worked with the campesinos and the indigenous communities, that they had their own history of fighting for their rights, and we became much more attuned to that. Mm-hmm. And then the coup d'etat hit in 2009, and of course that changed everything, and it showed us the strategic importance of Honduras for the U.S., and the importance of the people's reaction in Honduras to the coup, which was massive resistance. Amazing.
So let's stop there a minute, because I'm not sure if everybody will, first of all, understand it as a coup, and secondly, right, what it was and why 2009. Maybe you can talk a little bit about who the president was, sure, and what his initial policies or direction was, and then what kind of led to his removal.
Right. So the president at the time of the coup was Manuel Zelaya, and Honduras had in place a 2-party system where they sort of alternated. One party, the National Party, more conservative, and the Liberal Party, somewhat more liberal, but both of them nothing really exciting.
Sound like the Democrats and Republicans.
It kind of seems to have come from the U.S., the whole plan. And they have had coups in the past that the U.S. supported. But for a while before the 2009 coup, it was just kind of alternating around since 1981. Not that long, but since 1981. And then Manuel Zelaya, and I've actually been in meetings where asked him the question, like, why did you change? Because he was like an ordinary politician. And then he started talking about change in Honduras. And not only talking about change, but he literally sat down at a table with trade unionists, the peasant unions and peasant organizations, the indigenous. There's a whole number of indigenous and Afro-Honduran groups.
We'll talk about that
and
in a
their
minute.
organizations came, LGBT, feminist organizations. He started actually sitting down with people and organizations, they call them social movement in Honduras, and asking them, what do we need to do to alleviate the poverty that our country is sinking? We've done, and this in the meeting, he said this, he said, I did everything for the first years, and Honduras did everything the US asked us to do. You need a military base, you got it. We need to borrow money from the IMF and be sure we privatize this or that, you got it. You want this, we'll do it. And things are worse and worse for the Honduran people. So he went in a direction that he wanted to join what was called the Pink Tide at that moment. So Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, and others to roll back the neoliberal program, the program of privatization, weak state government, powerful militaries and security states, those kind of things. So he did all of this and started to write plans for it. And then the idea came up that we need a new constitution in Honduras. And that came from the people he had been sitting at the table. Contrary to what the press has said, the Honduran press said that he wanted to rewrite the constitution to make himself president for life. No. That idea came from all these movements. So they were going to have a referendum on June 28th, 2009. They were going to have a referendum where people would vote on whether or not to put on the ballot for the regular election in November 2009 a question of should we or should we not convene a constitutional convention. So it was way out. So just to make it clear, even if it had that referendum passed and then it went to the ballot, he would already have been out of office in November of 2009 anyway, and there was no re-election. So that was the last straw, and that was the last straw for the powerful economic oligarchs in Honduras, very right-wing, very conservative, really pretty violent group. And it was go ahead.
Well, I think we need to note that this is when Obama was president and Hillary Clinton, the great liberal, was the Secretary of State. So it was not happening under George Bush or Donald Trump. It was happening under the liberal black president. And
that's a really important point because it was also the last straw for the U.S. And although President Obama, at the moment of the coup, and what happened was the military showed up at the presidential residence the morning of the 28th, when there was supposed to be the referendum. They exchanged gunfire with the presidential guards, the bodyguards, who probably couldn't figure out what the heck was happening. They dragged President Zelaya out of the house in his pajamas, loaded him on a plane in Tegucigalpa, flew the plane to the U.S. military base, which is less than an hour and a half drive from Tegucigalpa, stopped at the U.S. military base briefly to do something, then continued on to Costa Rica, where they shoved him out on the tarmac of the airport in Costa Rica. So that's important.
He was done.
He was done. Well, they thought he was done. President Obama's initial reaction was at least, oh, this is, we don't support coups. But obviously he'd missed the briefing somewhere. We don't support coups. We don't want to go back to those dark days. That, I think, is almost a quote. But almost very short time afterwards, the State Department started talking about this was a political change of power, because what happened after the military did all that, they convened a congressional session at midnight where they didn't let any of Zelaya's people in the Congress, any of his Congress reps from his party, and they unelected him. There's really no way you can do it legally, but they said it was legal. So then the State Department starts reacting and talking about this is a political transfer of power,
And
et
then they
cetera,
had
et cetera.
elections shortly after that, right?
They
So
continued with the elections,
Yeah,
right, with the military in the street and armed, with protests, massive protests every single day for 175 days, I think, where people were being killed, arrested, beaten, disappeared, forcibly disappeared, which just means that you don't have the body, but they never
Yeah.
appear again. Usually, a few people will reappear.
so that's the background.
That's the background.
And one might imagine if the military is more aggressive and more assertive and there's pressure on the social movements not to protest and not to organize, that there would be, well, the violence that occurs under that kind of government means that large numbers of people probably don't feel comfortable staying there, or in many cases could not stay there. So it was shortly after that, if I'm right, that there was a large number of Honduran children that tried
Well, a
to...
little later.
Yeah, but there's a connection between
Right.
these two events, because it's not like the removal of Zelaya suddenly brought sunshine and flowers. I
Right.
mean, you're bringing back a very authoritarian government, and the state security forces are a little bit more aggressive, and that creates a certain political climate.
Right.
And if the people are disappeared and they come back from being disappeared, why would you want to stick around? So
Exactly.
I guess I'm segueing from that. Thank you for that. That's very helpful for us to get some context for this. But one of the favorite things that the White House and both political parties want to talk about is the root causes of migration. And then they have plans of investing money, and usually it's security money. But so this is one part of the root causes, the political situation in Honduras. The other part that I thought we could address a bit was the changes in climate that affect people's daily lives. And that may not be a legitimate reason to get asylum in the US, but it's certainly a motivating factor for why you would leave Honduras. Yes, so what are the environmental conditions today in Honduras, or in the last several years?
Well, I think what's important is, of course, there are physical environmental conditions that have always made Honduras vulnerable to hurricanes, flooding. They have a lot of water. And then policies, economic policies, and political policies inside Honduras, as well, driven by the US-supported government, that have increased the impact of climate disasters. And of course, we know that climate change has been increasing the number of disasters as it goes on, the number of hurricanes, the intensity of hurricanes.
So if you know a hurricane's coming, one of the things that may affect that disaster is preparation for it,
Exactly.
shelters for it,
Exactly.
maybe even regulations on how the houses can be built or where they can be built.
Right.
I mean, there's probably many things that could positively mitigate some
Right.
of the worst of the climate disasters, as opposed to doing nothing, which is
Right.
going to maximize whatever the disaster is that's coming through the air or from the river. Or
Right. And I have to say that it's even worse than not doing anything that you could do to mitigate. It's actually worse, because what happened under these policies was an intensification and a growth of the extraction economy. And by extraction economy, I mean lumber, mining, hydroelectric dams, and I call it they're all some kind of extraction, because you extract natural resources and they go to benefit somebody, but not
Yeah.
not the
well,
people.
if you take away lumber, it seems that the water, the rain that comes is
right.
just going to easily flow down, and you're going to
Right.
have a flood.
Deforestation.
And if you're doing mining, I don't know much about Honduras mining, but like in West Virginia, when you do strip mining, to be able to get to the coal, again, that destroys the environment, and you have more possibility of floods.
Right.
So
Exactly. So those kind of things, and I can give an example that prior to at the time of the coup, there were, I think, I've heard about 15 to 20% of the national territory was in what they call concessions to a mining company, to some project. Shortly after the coup, it rose to 35%. And by the time Juan Orlando Hernandez, the even more far right-wing dictator, came into power after the coup, it went up quickly to 65%, and right now it may even be more. And these projects, then that shows not only is it
You're saying 65% of the Honduran territory
is in concessions.
Is controlled by some private mining company or
they have the right to control
They
it.
have the right, so they can go there legally.
Right. And so that's really important in terms of getting an idea of the scope of this issue. So the other part of all these activities are that they reduce the amount of land available for small farmers and the small villages. There's internal displacement, even before there's a disaster, there's internal displacement by these projects, the mines, the dams, a few of the big agribusiness type projects displaced. And so there's also less food sovereignty or sustainability. People are already displaced and gathering in places that aren't really not safe.
Yeah.
And then you have the fact that money is not being used by the state to do any mitigation or prevention. Dams, levees, there's a number of things you could do.
When you talk about the dams, I think of the Agua Zarca Dam, which was in the Lenca territory. And I bring that up because the first response of the Honduran people was not to migrate. The first response was to resist and protest. So the Council of Indigenous People launched protests against the building of this dam. I assume that's one that got concessions.
Right.
David Castillo,
Right.
who was one of the chief owners of this just recently, I guess under the new government, was just recently found guilty for the murder of Berta Cáceres.
Right.
And he was a former U.S.-trained Honduran military intelligence officer who somehow got the concession for the dam that was going to displace large numbers of the indigenous Lenca people. Right. And they resisted, and Berta Cáceres was assassinated. Right. And I'm assuming other people were killed in the process as well. So.
And that's really, of course, Berta Cáceres' world has become an icon.
Yes, yes.
Before that, she was one of what we always used to say, famous amongst those who aren't famous, for her activism and leadership. And that project, there was a Honduran company involved that is owned by one of the oligarchic families, the Atala family, Atala Zahib family. And then there was various foreign investments. A Chinese company was involved at one time, but they withdrew as the conflict grew. They withdrew from the project.
Was this an IMF-backed, a World Bank-backed project, or was this all private funds?
You know, I am not entirely sure. Mostly private, but even in all the private funding in these Honduran projects, there's usually some IMF, World Bank, or the Central American Developmental Bank. There's usually something involved. And Berta is, of course, the most famous person who was assassinated in that, and her leadership is still missed by everyone. But there were others who were assassinated and others who were injured. And it went on for years, even after Berta's death.
She was killed in 2016. David Castillo was just found guilty, I guess, this year. So.
And the only reason I have to say, I mean, the trial finished after the election that brought the new government, but it was started before. And I think the only reason that even happened was because of the massive public opinion and organizing inside Honduras and internationally around the case of Berta Cáceres.
Well, I would assume the Honduras Solidarity Network had a contribution to that as
we
well.
We tried to contribute, yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of our delegations, before Berta was assassinated, one of our accompaniment delegations to go down, visit, and listen to people's stories and then bring them back to the U.S. was our goal. We went to the town of Rio Blanco where the project was, and we met with Berta Cáceres and with the people of the surrounding area and with the company. The company's name was DESA, that was the Honduran company, and the military, so, to tell them what we thought, and they told us what they thought, and so there you were. But this was all part of afterwards this even multiplied more, and in fact the saying in Honduras, they say, Berta didn't die, she multiplied. But that's the only reason David Castillo was charged. At the beginning they charged a few of the actual gunmen, and the pressure kept up. Then they charged, but that's still only the tip of the iceberg. And to this day, Berta's organization and the Honduras Solidarity Network and the movement
asking for further investigation.
We want more investigation and more complete justice all the way to the top of whoever said it was okay. Because you don't assassinate someone with the profile of Berta Cáceres. She won the Goldman Environmental Prize not that long before she was assassinated. That doesn't happen. Even somebody like David Castillo doesn't decide that on his own.
And I think it's important just to step back and make a side note that the social movements in Honduras and the solidarity movements in the United States were not just pushed around completely by the military. Although there was repression and there was violence, there was still a modest victory at the end because you found somebody guilty of the assassination. So which suggests that there's possible responses that the average person can make if they're working with other people. So we don't have a lot of time left, but I thought it would be good just to talk about the recent Honduran election, the first woman that's now in office, and what does this portend for the future? Right.
Well, it was a really big moment. After 13 years of a coup government and narco dictatorship, in November of 2021, in the election, the resistance, the electoral party that came out of this resistance movement, in alliance with a couple of other parties who were sick and tired of the narco dictatorship, waged this amazing campaign, and the people responded and elected Xiomara Castro, who's also the wife of Manuel Zelaya.
So Zelaya doesn't go away completely.
Zelaya is a big personality. But Xiomara is an activist and a person in her own right, not to be dismissed in any way. So she ran on a platform publicly published of getting rid of all the structures from the narco dictatorship, the narco corruption, and undoing the neoliberal program. So undoing the privatization of the energy,
the privatization of the
slowly,
concessions,
and looking for models, economic models that would serve the people. So this was all very open. So she won the election. I went to the inauguration. It was amazing. It was more like a big party in the football stadium. And she has done a whole number of things on her promise list. But she is facing pressure from the U.S. government that recognized her government, which was a big relief for all of us. It wasn't another coup, but has made clear that they don't agree with her rolling back of the privatization, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, this again, we're almost out of time here, but it just strikes me that this is a great example of the social movements in Honduras that kind of resulted after 13 years. You actually come back almost like the movement towards socialism after the coup against Morales. They come back and they win through the electoral process. But the fact that she has laid out a program that challenges the privatization and the returning to the public many of their resources probably bodes for some future conflicts with the U.S. and also within Honduras. So at some point we probably will have to have you back to discuss the unfolding events, because things where they are now, as you say, everything is fluid, and it will be interesting to see how many Bertas have been multiplied since
Right.
that.
There are a
since that
lot
ti-
of them already.
Since that time. So thank you, Victoria Cervantes, for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.